everyone. My name is Betsy Gomez. I am the Coalition Coordinator for the Comic Book Legal Defense Fund and the coordinator for the Banned Books Week Coalition. We are here today to talk about defending comics today. I have invited a couple of individuals from Leander, Texas to join us. They're currently facing a censorship issue in their hometown. Alexis, could you kick us off by introducing yourself?
Sure. I am Alexis Huddleston. I teach high school English in Leander ISD, which is just north of Austin, Texas.
Great, thank you. And Stephanie.
Hello, my name is Stephanie and I am a long-arm quilter, but I have two teenagers who are both in high school and Leander ISD in the fall. And I've also always been an active volunteer in our district.
Great, thank you so much. So Alexis, I'd like to have you kick us off. Could you tell us a little bit about what is happening in Leander, how things got started, how the administration is responding, some of the books that are affected?
Sure. So this year, last year, we wrote some new curriculum for the district, and part of that was adopting 2 book club units per grade level. And so the way that looks is we adopted 15 titles for each one of those book club units, and we try to make them contemporary, a lot of young adult, a good mix, and each book club unit has a different theme. And the kids choose from those 15 titles one book that they want to read, and if they finish that, they move on to another one. And during that time, they're meeting with other kids reading that same book. And so it all kind of started with one of our book club units for sophomores is a graphic novel unit. So all 15 of the options are graphic novels, and there are graphic novels like in other book clubs as well, but that one was just completely graphic novels. And there were some parent complaints, not just about the graphic novels, but about different books for being inappropriate and things like that. And one of the complaints that we heard, especially with the graphic novel unit, was that it wasn't rigorous enough. And so they decided, that was the first unit they decided to review as a district. And so they started this process of curriculum review where they brought in teachers, administrators, people across the district. And in the first, there were parents in the first meeting as well, but they would get assigned a book. 4 or 5 people would read it. They would meet to talk about it. And then at the end, they voted on whether or not they thought the book should stay in. And so in that first unit, when they published the results of that, we had 3 books removed and 1 paused in that graphic novel unit. And some of the books that were taken out were Kiss Number 8, Laura Dean Keeps Breaking Up With Me, and then The Lottery for a panel that has a breast on it. And then we had some paused books as well. One of the paused books was Speak. And we don't really know what it means if it's paused. So we're kind of still in limbo on whether or not students will have access to that in the upcoming year. And then that kind of snowballed into them reviewing all of the books for every book club. And in that process, we lost some more graphic novels. So My Friend Dahmer was targeted. We lost V for Vendetta, Why the Last Man, and then The Handmaid's Tale, the graphic novel adaptation, were all books that were also targeted, amongst other ones. But we saw that graphic novels had a higher rate of being removed. And we also saw that a lot of LGBTQ representation was targeted. And so that's kind of what started everything. And so we had a group of teachers who kind of came together, and community members like Stephanie, and parents that wanted to come in and support fighting that against this really loud, mostly a community member, parent voice in the community that was raising all these concerns about it being inappropriate and not wanting that content available for their students. And so, yeah, that's kind of what we've been dealing with for the past year.
Well, Stephanie, I'd like to hear from you about how you found out about the situation and how you got involved and why you thought it was important to be involved.
As I mentioned earlier, I'm already very active in our district, and I happened to be at the school board meeting the first time that the books were questioned publicly. They chose juicy excerpts and read them out of context. And what really got my attention was everything else with the district is a long, slow process. And literally, this was a parent complained October 22nd and November 7th, they were reviewing everything. And that sent up red flags for me. I did not get an opportunity to participate in the first review cycle. I had a kid that was in the grade level that affected, and he was down 4 choices because even though Speak was paused, it was not available for him to choose. Would he have chosen it? I don't care. There were great representations. There were great subjects. I've read all 4 of the books that were pulled from that unit, and my kid would have benefited from all of them. I would have had a discussion with him about Speak because some of the content might be too close to some personal experiences he's had, because it does deal with self-harm and sexual assault and those kind of things. But I would have let him read it because it was actually a really kind of cathartic read. Graphic novel is a way better adaptation for that story. It was so much better than the regular text. And so I started by emailing the governance team or our school board and the district superintendent, but I also showed up and spoke at board meetings. Another board meeting, they read an excerpt from a book that I'd happened to read. And so I was like, well, wait. I was here to talk about something else and I'm switching. And, kind of what they failed to mention is right after this, here's this great content that our teenage boys need to hear that's in this book. And so that's kind of been my goal. I've reached out to Facebook groups with people with similar ideas about reading and censorship as I have, to try and get more people to email in. I've put together letters and I've made them available. If somebody else wanted to communicate but didn't have time, they could copy and paste and have an email and get their viewpoint across. And so that was the big thing to me, like LGBTQ representation got hit hard. And when I look at the summary for what the review processes were, the summary information does not align with the decisions they're making. And so it's not clear to me as a parent why books are being removed, because KISS number 8 had less requests for advisement, had less requests for removal, and it was removed. Speak, way more concerns about advisement to the teachers and or pulling the book, and it only got paused. And so looking at all that, the only difference that I could see was LGBTQ experiences being expressed. And so that's kind of where my thing is. And the fact that some parents think that graphic novels are not intense blows my mind, because I have a kid that struggles with reading them. And I have seen kids that struggle reading that pick them up, love them, and it gets them hooked and it improves their literacy. So.
You're muted, Betsy.
Yeah, sorry. So one of the things we've long advocated for is that parents have the right to make decisions about what their own children read. And to me, it sounds like other parents in your community took that right away from you, Stephani.
Yes. And I actually, at one of the board meetings, I may have yelled a little bit at the board because I'm like, this is not okay. You took away my kid's choice. And it says right here in your policy, no other parent can censor my child. That's my job. And I have no problem with parents censoring their own children. That has always been an option in our district. So, part of me is like, you're complaining because there's a choice, not because, and that, they want to say you're forcing their kids, but you're not. It is a choice.
All right, thank you. Let's talk a little bit about the impact of this censorship. Starting with the impact you think your students are going to experience and your kids are going to experience. And then, Alexis, I'd like to have you talk also about the impact on teachers in the district.
Yeah, it's been really tough because we did one complete book club across all grade levels before we started reviewing the books. And so we had just finished our first book club unit when they started the review, and like November was when they started to get the ball rolling. And we had at the end of that book club, I had kids write book reviews for what they had read, and like overwhelmingly positive. And the reviews that the kids wrote that were negative were mostly just like, oh, like this book wasn't a good fit for me. Like they didn't have any concerns about any of the same concerns we hear parents bringing up about the content being inappropriate or them not wanting their kids to be exposed to whatever. I mean, the students have zero concerns about that. And so many of my kids chose books that I was honestly shocked by. Like one of the books that we offered, not a graphic novel, but None of the Above, which is about an intersex girl who finds out she's intersex and then is learning to deal with that. I had like shock, and it's kind of like a romance story. Like shockingly, I had a 14-year-old boy choose that and write a review that was like, oh my gosh, everyone should read this book because I had no idea. And like, that's what we want. I mean, we want kids to understand other people's experiences and to be interested in what they read. And so when we start removing these books, a lot of people are saying like, let's replace them with the classics. And I mean, we wanted to have contemporary books in the first place because as a teacher, students are not generally interested in the classics. No one has read Romeo and Juliet that I've ever seen and then been like, well, now I'm a reader. So, I mean, like, I want them to read. I want them to read when they leave my room. I want them to read when they leave high school. And we're trying to create that while also teaching them skills. And so a lot of like these complaints have been, well, you're teaching my child about sex, or you're teaching my child about what, and I've never taught that. I teach English, so I'm teaching like analysis, theme, characterization, like, and your students applying that to a book they actually enjoy, which is really exciting to see in the classroom. So it's sad because a lot of these kids aren't going to go out on their own and find books. And so when we have in this curriculum an opportunity to say, here are 15 books that we tried to choose because they're high interest, because they have quality stories in them, then we're getting kids to read as part of the curriculum, and hopefully that snowballs into them continuing to read. So it's been really disheartening to see because our kids understand like graphic novels are rigorous. They are hard to read. And I know, like Stephanie mentioned that as well, there have also been teachers who have complained about the rigor of graphic novels. And that really is very frustrating as an educator because I'm like, you have work to do if you don't know that graphic novels are rigorous. That you're reading text and image at the same time. There's so many things that go into the creation of a graphic novel, the reading of a graphic novel. And even in the book review process, I was in the group that reviewed V for Vendetta, and there wasn't anyone in our group who felt that V for Vendetta should be removed as an option for juniors in their social commentary unit. And we all were like talked about how complex it was. Like the biggest complaint that we had as we were reading it was, this book is really hard to read because there's so many characters you're following, and like all the people in the government look the same, which is like intentional, and that's a great choice to talk about. But for students, like that's a hard read. And that was our biggest complaint. So seeing it removed, I'm like, we are actually removing just a different type of rigor from the classroom. And I don't understand why would we want to just replace that with a play that is by Shakespeare that is hard to decode? Like that, I mean, I feel like that's the difference is parents don't really remember when they were in school, if they even read the play, what it was actually about, because we have the same type of content in all of these classics that we have in these contemporary choices. And I feel like they have this kind of fondness for what they went through when they were in school. And I'm like, and it's frustrating because I feel like we've come a long way in terms of accepting graphic novels and comics as like very valid forms of literature. But there's still, has shown me this year, there's still a long way to go. Because I think a lot of people are like, well, that's not really reading. And I hear my kids say the same thing. And I'm like, yes, it is. And we have to have those conversations of audiobooks are a valid way to read. Graphic novels are a valid way to read. And so it makes me really sad because I want my kids to read and to love reading as much as I do. And when we take away these choices, like we're just limiting them to the point where, of course, they're not going to be engaged. And that's the problem, is they're just totally disengaged when we don't actually try to connect to them as people, because they are, and we should give them those choices and let them see themselves in stories. So it's been very frustrating. I think the kids are being really impacted, and I think it's kind of created a divide among teachers. There are the teachers who are on the side of let's defend these books and this is ridiculous, and there are the teachers who, well, I didn't feel comfortable offering this as a choice. And that's been really hard to see, because obviously I would love if all teachers were like, of course I want kids to have that choice. So I feel like we're kind of in a place where I don't know where we're going from here. But I think it's gonna probably get a little bit worse before it gets better, honestly.
Yeah, I would have to agree. And it's interesting what you said about the kids. So one of my kids actually, I think that was for their last paper of the English school year, they had to do like a journalism interview. And so my kid chose to write about the book controversy in our district, and, had to present it neutrally. And at the end, she was like, so if you don't like it, go sign up for the committee that reviews stuff. They allow students. But she actually said, listening to this whole thing, she feels like our district isn't willing to listen to students. They don't want students to speak up. They don't want student voices heard. And if that's not the case, which I actually think that our district wants to hear kids, but they're not telling the kids that. Their actions and their language is telling our kids not to speak up. You don't vote, there's no use spending your energy fighting for things. Big concern. Kids don't get a choice in which books get removed. I know that it says they can participate, but I know in the groups and reviews I did, we did not have students in my group. I'm not sure I don't think we had any in the review process. And
to clarify something, I think they typically allow students in the review process, but didn't this year because they didn't want to invite students to be exposed to inappropriate content, was their reasoning there.
Yeah. And that spoke volumes. My kid who's was not yet in high school was like, so they don't want to hear from us. It's affecting me directly and I don't have a say, and that's not okay. And like you talked about different challenges. One of my kids, when they were younger, would not read because they could not visualize the stories. So they had no interest. But if I would read them a story, they loved it because they could visualize, they could see it. So we started off, combining audiobooks with the traditional books so that they could read on their own, hear the story as they were reading it, and help them visualize. And even to this day, they still have challenges with certain materials on really being able to visualize it, which, can make comprehension harder. A kid that struggles with reading graphic novels, and yet has read some great graphic novels that were easier to follow. So, just like we have picture books, then chapter books, then novels, graphic novels are kind of built the same way. And it does help to add, I think, to the visualization that students have.
It's unfortunate that in a lot of these situations, it's ultimately the students and the kids in the community who are harmed. And Alexis, she made the point earlier about the kids didn't comment on content that made them uncomfortable, because kids, I think one of the things that a lot of people fail to recognize is that they will stop reading something if they're uncomfortable with it. And, if they're reading, that's the point, right? So let's talk a little bit about kind of the resolution of the situation. Could you describe your ideal resolution and how you think that compares to what you expect the reality to be?
My ideal resolution would be district goes on an apology tour and just says, I'm so sorry we took these books away. You can have them all. I know that's not going to happen. I guess my second choice would be, at first they were talking about repurposing the books that got removed, possibly into classroom libraries or school libraries, and basically just removing them as curriculum options, which I would be fine with, because I mean, I have a vast classroom library that we were lucky enough in our district that this past year, with adopting this curriculum, the district paid for about 300 books for every high school English teacher, of contemporary books. So we have some graphic novels and other great books in those libraries that we each have a single copy of. So if we kind of just said, okay, this book is, Kiss Number 8, Laura Dean Keeps Breaking Up With Me, they're no longer an option for the curriculum, but they're in your classroom library. Kids can still choose to read them, and my students could still make that choice during that unit. It just wouldn't be this is officially part of our curriculum. That would kind of be my ideal outcome. Or, if it moves to a different grade level, even like this, this graphic novel would fit great in this unit, so let's kind of shift it here. That would be kind of my ideal. I feel like what is going to happen is they are going to actually remove some of the books, maybe from campus altogether. And I think some of them, like the ones that are paused, I think it's possible we might get to keep them in our units, which would be awesome. Because they're about, I would say, we have less paused ones than removed ones, but it's pretty close in number. So I think it's possible we still get to keep those. And so I think that's kind of going to be the reality. And unfortunately, part of that reality is that our board is currently working on writing a policy to prevent inappropriate materials from winding up in the classroom again, which is really unfortunate, because I think it may not have an effect on some of the books that made it through this review process. I think they'll get through unscathed, but I am concerned about future materials adoption and what that means for what we can actually offer students. And unfortunately, I think there are a lot of educators who are worried, how is that going to affect our classroom libraries and our school libraries if we have this policy in place that's limiting or defining what is inappropriate?
Well, and that's just it. Who gets to define what's inappropriate?
Right.
Yeah, that's kind of been another thing that my kids and I, it's become a family joke that what we allow, like content wise for books. I used to be really harsh on like what my kids could read. And when my oldest was in middle school, he was reading a book and I was reading with him, because we do that a lot. And I was like, okay, we'll skip these pages. I think it's inappropriate for someone your age to read. I think it's inappropriate for the character to be acting this way. If you really want to read it, you can. If you have questions, talk to me, but other people, don't talk with your friends, because their parents get to decide. He came back and he's like, well, I don't see why this scene is any different than this scene over here that you let me read. And I was like, oh, well. So then in that case, I was like, okay, maybe I need to reframe, because what I was worried about, he didn't even pick up on. And even, one of the books that I know has been a focus of the parents that are trying to remove books, I almost missed one of the scenes that they're really worried about, because the way it was described was not obvious for someone that's 45, let alone a teenager. But I also think we underestimate our students so much. I really hope that the district will, at a minimum, repurpose, but like Alexis said, we had a great election recently, and we've got some more, I think, progressive people on our board, but the majority still follows along with the parents that are looking to have things censored. And so it terrifies me, because I think when you look at the history of our city and our district, it is all, they're being pushed out of their comfort zone, and the reaction is to clamp down and stop any change at all. And that's from my perspective. A couple of years ago, our public library tried to have a drag queen story hour. It got shut down. Speaking of graphic novels, is it Lila Sturgis was supposed to?
Yeah, Lila was supposed to speak and she got canceled.
And she got canceled the day of. I took my kids, we got to the library and they're like, sorry, she's not here. And And then this year with our school board, it has been rough on them because the first thing out the door was the new dress code, which was amazing. We had to give up some of the amazing, but overall, huge step in the right direction, followed by policy changes that specifically added sexual orientation, gender identity as protections for our staff members. And that was heavily contested. And then next it was the books. So I think that a lot of the parents that think this stuff is inappropriate are not comfortable with accepting and being open to all people, even when they disagree. And they're just digging in their heels trying to grasp because they feel, the rug being pulled out from underneath them. And so I don't want these books gone. I want our kids to continue to be open. And I've seen like the huge change even, I remember in high school, nobody came out in high school. I'm not that old. And now like in middle school, oh, rainbows everywhere. And, there's very few kids there are kids that are uncomfortable, and I'm not saying they're not, but the vast majority of kids have exploded the vocabulary in the LGBTQ corner. And I have to ask my kids all the time. And so I think we need these experiences, and kids need a point of reference. I can't talk to my kids about some of the experiences because I don't have them. But if we read about it together, we can have a great conversation. And like one of the books, The Handmaid's Tale, I read the graphic novel, and I really didn't see anything that was inappropriate for high school students. We're not giving it to elementary kids. It's a high school book. And I mean, it's The Handmaid's Tale. The whole thing about the society is purity and and just like very strict control. So their actions are inappropriate, but you have to understand that context, and it's not presented necessarily in a way that says it's appropriate, but there's nothing graphic about it, even in the graphic novel. So yeah, I'm hoping that our district will do the right thing, but I'm really concerned, like Alexis said, about what we're going to be preventing from getting into the hands of students. And as a parent, I'd much rather some of these topics be handled as a book club unit where they are analyzing it and they're having discussions around the social issues, because you get a very different experience from a book when you're in that conversation and when you're analyzing it than when you're reading for fun. And so I think even though it's, the lesser of two evils as far as the options go, I still think it does a huge disservice to our community and to our youth.
Great. Thank you both so much for the conversation today. And I just want to say that CBLDF remains committed to helping you through this process. I know it's difficult. I know we may not ultimately win, which is unfortunate, but we'll do everything we can to support you. It's unfortunate reality that, we see a lot more acceptance of LGBTQ content in society and in our children, but the opposition seems to be getting smaller but louder. And so we're still fighting a lot of that. On that note, I'd like to ask you just kind of for some last comments, what advice would you give to educators and parents in a community that might be facing the same sort of situation that you are?
I would say definitely like you need a support system. It's exhausting work. It takes a long time. This started in the fall and it's still not resolved. And I honestly don't know if by the end of next year it'll be resolved. But if it weren't for the other teachers in the district, not just high school teachers, tons of middle school teachers came to support us and spoke out, wrote to the board. We were able to kind of split up and say, like, let's reach out to different organizations. And honestly, like CBLDF, other organizations, authors have been so supportive and so helpful and willing to like get the message out and connect us with people who can help. Parents, elementary school teachers, all kinds of people like came together. And honestly, without that community, I would have been like, this is not a one-person job and it would be too exhausting. You have to have that group and just be willing to ask for help. And also just take a break every now and again. Like sometimes you need to just be like, you know what? We all spoke at the board meeting last week, all 40 of us, and we all wrote, 10 emails this week. Like, let's just take like a couple days off and breathe, because there's going to be another round that we're going to have to be ready for. So I would definitely say rest and lean on your community.
Yeah, I would say as a parent, I think your first thing should always be to ask questions of your child's teacher. I got notifications from my kid's teacher 2 weeks in advance of picking a book. But like I did ask, because I had a friend go, well, what if I don't want my kid exposed to that comment and there's a book club sitting next to him that's discussing the book? And I was like, oh, so then I asked questions and found out, oh, book clubs work way differently than my English class. Yeah, too many years ago. And so like asking questions and finding out, asking your board, emailing your board, getting involved, showing up and speaking at citizen comments. If nothing else, as a parent, it makes me feel good about doing an effort and doing everything that I can. But I mean, even going and telling the board, hey, get the teachers out here, let them describe what they're doing. Let them show us what's going on in the classroom. I really think a lot of the concerns are because of miscommunication and misunderstanding. And so I think that would be it. But yeah, finding groups. I have reached out to groups that are community minded looking for inclusion. I've reached out to my church's social action group, reached out to friends that I have that are against censorship. We've shown up, we've spoken up. We continue to at least have 1 or 2 people at board meetings, because every week there's like at least 6 people from the other side every single week, and they're out of material. So they're just repeating what they've heard. This coming weekend, which will be in the past by the time this airs, but our board is having their diversity and equity and inclusion training. And so I've reached out and said, hey, anybody that wants to speak to the agenda item, please come and share your voice, because I guarantee you that all of these graphic novels that have been pulled fall under that diversity, equity, and inclusion training, and the importance of those voices. And it's those kind of things, like even if it's only 1 or 2 of us, just showing them we're not giving up. We don't care how loud they're being. We're here, And so I think that's important. And they've been very loud. They tried to do a day where they pulled their kids from school, basically to hurt the district's financial position. And it was, I think, what they usually average about 1,000 students absent out of like 43,000 students. And that one day maybe had 1,000 extra kids absent. And we have no way of knowing why those kids were absent, but the number was even less different than the following half day that we had. So, that tells me that there's not a huge group for that.
All right. Thank you, Alexis and Stephanie, for sharing your story with us today. It is very isolating to be in the position that you're in, and I'm so glad that y'all have found community. I'm so glad that we can help you. And I really hope that we can find our way through this and come up with your ideal resolution. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having us.
Thank you very much for having us.
Thank you, Alexis and Stephanie. I'm joined now by Jeff Trexler, Interim Executive Director of CBLDF, and Karen Evans, our Education Coordinator. Hi, Jeff and
Thanks,
Karen.
Betsy.
Jeff, let's talk about some of the other challenges that are facing the comics industry.
Yeah, thanks, Betsy. It was really good to hear from the team at Leander, because what they were talking about was so important. It highlighted an important shift that we've seen in defending comics from when the CBLDF started to what we're now experiencing today. Back when we started, back in the 1980s and 90s, a lot of the attention was directed at comic shops, and particularly arresting people who were selling books. I mean, books previously had been associated with largely with kids And here we had these comic shops coming into neighborhoods. They were seen as something strange and new, and they were selling adult books, and people dealt with it the way they deal with this sort of thing in certain communities, by arresting the folks who were selling the books. That threat has expanded in a way over the years. We may not be seeing as much in the way of arrests of people working at comic shops, but we are seeing a more expanded attack just in terms of wherever comic can be found. People are now trying to block access to those books. At Leander, it was a classic case of trying to stop the spread of graphic novels at schools and in public school libraries. But we're also seeing attacks directed at other places where people that have new access to comics, in particular online. Algorithmic censorship has become a priority here at the CBLDF because we're seeing attacks on comics on multiple fronts, from payment systems, social media, online shopping platforms. There are new standards, sometimes even stricter than the comics code, put in place that are leading to books being banned, creators being banned, stores being knocked off the web, or being refused access to payments. What's making this even more an intense problem is that while we tend to think of things like Facebook or Twitter or Shopify as private companies, a number of these platforms are being pressured by governments in countries worldwide to impose standards that are in keeping with what these various companies and local communities deem to be eliminating what are seen as threats to the social order or threats to national integrity. This pressure that's being placed on companies, if they want to work in the country, they need to adhere to these standards, are pressures that are now being felt worldwide for comics creators worldwide. And remember, while a lot of it is on the surface being directed at obscene imagery or imagery that's sexually explicit, the sort of things we saw in the comics code, the real target in a number of these instances is not so much the imagery, but it's the fact that people are creating these comics that are challenging the social order. They really are challenging they're challenging the powers that be. They're challenging orthodoxy. They're challenging the conventional wisdom. And I think that protecting the ability of people from all different perspectives to use comics to express themselves is an important part of what we've been doing. Along with comics being accessible everywhere, is that comics as a creative medium are accessible to everybody. Everybody can be a creator. Everybody can sell books. We can even wear our fandom. We can wear the characters that we like. We can tell our own stories. And in order to protect people and their creative side, we are giving people the legal knowledge that they can do to create their own books, to protect their own books, whether it's intellectual property, coming up with strong contracts. Because the way we see legal knowledge, it's not just an important tool for building your comics career, but it is also a sword and a shield so that everybody can defend their rights to express themselves through the comic arts.
Thank you, Jeff. I think this is just kind of further evidence of what CBLDF has been encountering over the years. What we originally had were discrete and acute attacks, the arrest of a retailer, the challenge of a specific comic, but the attacks on the right to make, read, sell, publish comics have become increasingly chronic. One of the trends we're seeing is ongoing state level legislative attempts to regulate content. There are a couple of areas in which this is particularly prominent. Critical race theory, which I'm sure a lot of people have seen in the news. There are a number of states, Florida, Texas, Idaho, Iowa, Oklahoma, and Tennessee are notably leading this attack on the use of critical race theory in educational settings. This would impact things like John Lewis's March or the upcoming graphic novelization of the 1619 Project. And it could have impacts on other people of color. Los Bros Hernandez, T-Buoy's The Best We Could Do. These have been very successful attempts to censor the content that students are seeing in schools. Another area where we're seeing attacks is LGBTQ plus content. This has been ongoing for years. We're seeing more legislative attempts to regulate that content, and that would impact any number of comics. And finally, there's a much more insidious legislative attack that's happening. There are a number of laws that they've tried to pass which would remove the traditional protections for educators and librarians when it comes to harmful to minors laws. Usually educators and teachers have leeway in what they can present to children. to students. What they're trying to do is to remove these protections so that if a teacher were to give Roby Harris's "It's Perfectly Normal" to a student in the course of sexual education, they could potentially be criminally liable for sharing that book. The same thing could happen with librarians who share a graphic novel that has incidental nudity with a teenager. And these are very frightening laws that have so far failed, but we need to continue to monitor them. We've been monitoring this type of legislation and much more in the last several years.
As you can see, we have a lot of work to do. So please continue to follow us at cbldf.org. There we go. On social media for the latest news and resources. We've been hosting a lot of events, inviting expert panelists to come in. We have a great resource section to help you educate yourself and spread the word on these issues. Thank you so much for joining us, and thank you to the team at Comic-Con International for the opportunity to present today and all of their support. Thank you, everyone, and be well.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks all. Thank you.